Greetings and welcome back to 303. We are in Senior English A, and we now turn to the works of the metaphysical poet John Donne. I'm with you on page 480, 481 in our introductory comments first. John Donne, metaphysical poet. Let's begin with the connecting to the essential question on page 480. Let's take a few notes as we get ready to read. John Donne was called witty not only because his work was amusing, but also because it used clever comparisons. Let's write that down in 2B. Right away, John Donne's work is considered witty because of his clever comparisons. Now later we're going to call them conceits and that kind of thing. But right now let's just call it that. A poetic device that John Donne invented was the odd but clever comparison of things that at first seem very different. Noting such comparisons will help you answer the essential question, what is the relationship of the writer to tradition? Let's go now to 2B, and let's take a few notes under literary analysis on page 480. Donne and his followers wrote metaphysical poetry. Let's write that term down. Metaphysical poetry. Think of it this way. Physical, right? Meta means beyond the physical. That is to say, non-physical. Okay? Metaphysical poetry. Poetry characterized by intellectual displays and concern with metaphysical or philosophical issues. It uses the following poetic devices. First, let's make sure we got these in our notes at 2B. Conceits. A conceit is an extended comparison that will link objects or ideas not commonly associated. For example, Donne compares two lovers to the two legs of a drawing compass. Okay? Paradoxes. Images or descriptions that appear self-contradictory, but that reveal a deeper truth. For example, in Holy Sonnet 10, death, thou shalt die. We want to interpret these conceits and paradoxes that we find in John Donne's work and analyze how word choices result in poetry that's fresh and engaging. Let's go to reading strategy real quickly. To understand these poems, analyze the author's perspective or view the author's taking and how word choice affects meaning and tone. Remember, Donne's work is divided into a youthful period during which he wrote love poems and a later phase during which he wrote religious works. Donne's poems are arranged in rough chronological order, so you can see evidence of his change of heart. Also, even though the speaker in each poem is not necessarily Donne himself, the poet is closely identified with the speaker. A recommendation of a chart like the one to the right might be utilized here to infer speaker's situation, motivation. These in turn will give you clues to the author's perspective. Take a look at those vocabulary words there, those 6 vocab words on the bottom of page 480. Highly recommend that you're familiar with those words. Now, who is this Donne and why should we care? Let's go to page 481 and take a few notes really quickly. Notice dates, 1572, give or take. Dies in 1631. If you need help here to place him, think of it this way. We put Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, at 1600. So that gives you kind of a working idea of where we are. All right, let's read and take a few notes. Donne's life and poetry seem to fall neatly into 2 contradictory parts. Wild, young Jack Donne wrote clever love poems read by sophisticated aristocrats. In later life, sober Dr. John Donne, Dean of St. Paul's, and the most popular preacher in England, published widely read meditations and sermons. Contradiction and conflict were the stuff of Donne's life. They were also at the heart of his poetic style. As Jack, or as John, Donne, the writer, excelled at dramatizing and wittily resolving the contradictions of life. Take a look at some of these headings here. We've got 3 of them. Make sure you've got notes under each one. Religious conflict. A distant relative of Sir Thomas More, Donne was raised a Catholic. In the England of Queen Elizabeth I, Catholics faced prejudice and restrictive laws. Although Donne studied at Oxford and Cambridge, he never obtained his degree, probably because of his refusal to compromise his Catholicism by swearing an oath acknowledging the supremacy of the king over the church. Later, he abandoned Catholicism, joined the official Church of England. To this day, scholars debate whether Donne experienced the general conversion. Then this thing about secret marriage. This is interesting. After taking part in 2 naval expeditions against the Spanish, Donne served as private secretary to one of the Queen's highest-ranking officials, Sir Thomas Egerton. Bright, clever, charming, Donne secretly wed Anne Moore, his employee's niece, in 1601. Again, scholars throw doubt on Donne's motives. Some hold that he married for love. Others maintain that he hoped his marriage to the daughter of an influential family would promote his career. If Donne counted on this possibility, though, he was sadly mistaken. Anne's father disapproved of the union, and so Donne's marriage temporarily ruined his chances for social advancement. For many years, the devoted couple lived plagued by poverty and illness, in the midst of which Donne still managed to write influential poetry. He eked out a living writing religious tracts and serving as temporary secretary to several aristocrats. Donne finally attained a secure position in 1615 when, at the assistance of King James, he entered the clergy. Finally, success. After serving as royal chaplain, Donne became Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, 1621, a post he held until his death. He became one of the most popular preachers of his day. We want to write that down. He became one of the most popular preachers of his day. No, we'll see this with Meditation 17. No longer the writer of sly or witty passionate verses, he published widely read sermons and religious meditations. Jack Donne's days were over, and John Donne's fame was spreading. Just a little bit more about the author. Fired and briefly imprisoned for eloping with the 17-year-old Anne, Donne reportedly wrote his briefest and some of say his most accessible poem, John Donne and Donne Undone. From this simple beginning, Donne's marriage would inspire some of the most profound love poems in the English language. The marriage also produced many children. The Donnes had 12, of whom 7 were still living when Anne Donne died in childbirth in 1617. Let's now turn to the first of several offerings by John Donne. And I'm with you now on page 482. And the poem is just simply called Song. Now we're going to see several, can I say this? We're going to see several poems called Song. And so you want to make sure that this is the John Donne offering called Song, okay? And I just want to make a couple of brief observations about this poem before we get started. Already at 3A, let's write it down. We're going to look at 2 poems in somewhat contiguity. The first is called Song. The second is called Valediction Forbidding Mourning. If you flip the page from 483 to 484, you'll see that title, and that will be the second one that we will see. Both of these titles share in common the following. 2 things. I would write this down already. 2 things. You can either write it at 3A or at level 1. 1, John Donne writes these poems for his girl. Okay, for his wife or his lover. It's fairly obvious from these poems that Donne was very much into Anne and wanted to write love poetry for her. Okay, so both of these are love poems. Got me? Number 2, in both of these poems, he is telling her, don't be sad because I have to leave and go away. Right? Don't be sad because I have to leave and go away. We'll come back to this when we talk at 3B and personal relationships. But it seems to me, to the text, but it seems to me that maybe one of the hardest things seniors report they have to deal with in high school is if they do find somebody they're totally into, then there's this question of separation anxiety. What happens when I really want to be with this person, but then, for example, I have to be apart from this person? So, for example, a few years ago, I had 2 seniors, fell deeply in love in their senior year, both accepted to really good schools, but are you ready for this? Different schools. One on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. Question: do we break up, right? Do we just blow up the relationship and then go our separate ways? Do we, one of the 2 of us, decide to not go to that school so that we attend the same school, right? Or rather, do we go ahead and do what they ended up doing, and that is go to our separate schools but remain in very close relationship, which means a long-distance relationship. Good idea, bad idea. This is the discussion points before. And John Donne's poetry, believe it or not, helped play a part in the decision making. No kidding. Why? Because Donne will address the very question. What is it like when the guy has to leave the girl and the girl is not really going to like it very much? Let's go ahead now and take a look at the poem itself. We'll maybe have some sense of what's going on with this poem. By the way, just to kind of scan. And remember, this is one of the reasons that we are learning to read, so that we can then learn how to read not only literature, but everything else we have to read at the university, our psychology, our history, our math, or whatever. Hey, take a look at this poem really quickly and identify that you'll see it's divided up into parts. Are you looking at it with me? Before we even read it, take a look at this. Do you see, we're obviously making a 2B observation, right? Do you see that it's divided up into parts where you will have 8-line stanzas? Do you see this? Take a look at it. 8-line stanzas, over and over repeated. So how many 8-line stanzas do you have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes? Okay. So you've got 8-line stanzas, that is to say 40 lines. Then notice the end rhyme. Notice, go rhymes with show. Thee rhymes with me. A, B, A, B. Then I, notice, rhymes with die, the last line. And then best and jest rhyme together. Do you see this? Every one of these stanzas follows this A, B, A, B, C, D, D, C construction. All right? Now this is poetic intentionality. So let's just put it in our notes at 2B really quickly. This is a classic example of John Donne playing games with, no doubt, no question, with end rhyme and with stanza formulation. All right? That's pretty much all we're going to say, though, at this point about this poem at 2B. Let's now read the poem at level 1 and see if we can figure out anything he's saying to his girl, where he basically is telling her, don't be sad if I have to go away. Let's read. Sweetest love. I'm on page 482. The title again is Song. Sweetest love, I do not go for weariness of thee, nor in hope the world can show a fitter love for me. But since that I must die at last, 'tis best to use myself in jest, thus by fainted deaths to die. Yesternight the sun went hence, and yet is here today. He hath no desire, nor sense, nor hath sure sort of way. Then fear not me, but believe that I shall make speedier journeys, since I take more wings and spurs than he. Oh, how feeble is man's power, that if good fortune fall, cannot add another hour, nor a lost hour recall. But come bad chance, and we join to it our strength, and we teach it art and length itself, or us to advance. When thou sighest not wind, but sighest my soul away. When thou weepest, unkindly kind, my life's blood doth decay. It cannot be that thou lovest me as thou sayest. If in thine my life thou waste, thou art the best of me. Let not thy divining heart forethink me any ill. Destiny may take thy part, and may thy fears fulfill, but think that we are but turned aside to sleep. They who one another keep alive, ne'er parted be. Now let's take a look. First of all, let's just point out the interesting title, Song. Jot down in your notes at 2B, why do you think he called this poem Song? There's a few answers here, potentially. One of those answers is, the rhythms of this poem read like a song, right? In other words, there's harmonious rhythms here. Excuse me. And when you read this poem, you cannot help but kind of get the sense of the melody, that is to say, song. Other critiquers of this poem have pointed out that John Donne loves to play with words, dare we say it, twist words even. And he loves the idea that you're going to look at this title and you're going to recognize that there is a word missing. Jot down what you think that word that's missing would be. Especially once we've read this poem, you can kind of obviously guess, right? That is to say, love song. You get me? In other words, he's going to remove the word love from the title and just call it song, but it's fairly obvious what this is. This is a love song, okay? As we've already said, when we meet our next poem, Valediction for Betty Morning, we'll point out the ways in which these two poems have very, very similar kinds of backgrounds. Namely, don't be sad. He's got to go away. Let's look at each one of these stanzas, these different parts, these 5 stanzas, and let's get a sense at all, if at all, of what it is that he's saying. And some of you will say, this is very fascinating language for the guy to give to the girl as he leaves her saying, don't be sad, don't be sad. Look at the first one. Sweetest love, I do not go for weariness of thee. Whoa, jot down what you think, what he says. I'm not going away. Why? I'm not going away because I'm tired of you. So in other words, don't interpret my leaving and having to go on this trip as I'm getting tired of you and so I'm running away from you. Nor in hope the world can show a fitter love for me. In other words, I'm not going out into the world looking to try and find another girl to replace you. One that maybe is more fit for me. We today might say something like one that's better looking or more hot or something like that. Notice he says, but since that I must die at last, 'tis best to use myself in jest, thus by fainted deaths to die. If you read your footnotes, you recognize what he's saying. We've all got to die. And dying is a departure of a kind. Therefore, I'm going to go ahead and practice dying by leaving you, because leaving you is the worst imaginable death. In other words, I would rather die physically than to die being away from you, having to go on this trip. In other words, let's put it in our own words at level 1. What has he just told his girl? 2 important things. 1, I really don't want to go. 2, I really don't want to go. Right? Do you get me? In other words, I'm leaving, but it's not really my choice. And please don't interpret my leaving as somehow wanting to be away from you. Now he goes to some interesting comparisons. For example, how about the sun? Yesternight the sun went hence. Right? And yet is here today. I mean, once you start breaking this poetry down, it's actually not as complicated as at first it sounded. He says to his girl, hey, look up at the sky. There's the sun this morning, right? Now, last night, if you had been totally into the sun and it went away, you would have started blowing snot all over the place because you were sad that the sun had gone away. But look, it came back this morning. In other words, there is always the hope for some kind of a return. Notice, he hath no desire, the sun, hath no desire nor sense, nor half so short a way. In other words, the sun only has to go a small distance as opposed to me. I've got to go on a long trip. Then fear not me, top of 483, but believe that I shall make speedier journeys. In other words, I'm going to be back even faster than the sun. Coming back, since I take more wings and spurs than he. In other words, I'm going to go faster than the sun because I have motivation to get back here. So in other words, one more time, let's write it down. Stanza 2, he basically says, if the sun can go away and come back, so can I. And I'll be back faster than the sun because I'm more motivated than the sun to get back to you. Now the third stanza is fascinating because he starts to become a little bit philosophic. Take a look at this. Oh, how feeble is man's power, that if good fortune fall, cannot add another hour, nor a lost hour recall. He says it's interesting. Human beings have this notion that they can do anything, especially if they are having good fortune, which seems to almost suggest like money and power. But he says, you notice how oftentimes in life, no matter how much money or power you have, there are certain things you cannot undo, no matter how much you would like to. What do you think he's saying here about the trip he's got to take? Jot it down. What do you think he's saying about the trip he has to take? He's saying, I got to go on this trip. And then he says, it's interesting how no matter how much money and power a guy has, sometimes you just got to live with stuff that happens and you cannot undo it or change it. Obvious, right? But he says, come bad chance. In other words, things might go sideways for me. And we join to it our strength, and we teach it art and length itself or us to advance. In other words, if sometimes you cannot change something, you have to learn that something you don't like. You have to learn how to kind of live with that something. In other words, you kind of figure out a way to get on. Humans, in other words, are these amazing species that have the ability to somehow adapt. What is he telling us? You're gonna have to accept the fact I gotta go. I gotta go for a while. Now this is interesting because she's crying, right? She's crying, and he's going to play a very interesting word game. This has blown the minds of a lot of my seniors when they hear this argument. Follow this one. We'll see this as well in Valediction for Wedding Morning. There are these lovers who stand at the airport, and one has to go and the other has to stay, and all kinds of snot's getting blown all over the place, and wailing and crying and wanting to hug and all that kind of stuff. And it's clear John Donne's got no energy for it. He's got no interest in drama queen. And so he's going to say something very interesting about crying when people who care for each other have to separate. Watch what he says. When thou sighest, that is to say cries, thou sighest not wind, but sighest my soul away. Now, let me help you understand this. He says, if we are truly in love, we are one, not two. Correct? We are one, not two. This is famous language, right? This goes back to that notion from the Greeks that when we are born, our soul is a perfect sphere, like a basketball, cut in half. Half of our soul goes into ourselves, half of our soul goes into someone else. When we meet that someone else, we call that someone else our what? Soul mate. You've maybe heard this language before. And when we come together, it's that notion of completeness. In other words, I no longer am half, but now I'm whole with the other person. But follow this. He says to his girl, if you and I are one, and you're doing one of these all the time, because you're sad, the sighing, the breath that you're allowing to leave your body is actually partly me, because I am part of you. In other words, don't get rid of me. All this sighing. I'm part of your breath. That is to say, I'm part of you. And every time that you're sighing like this, that's like part of me leaving you. Or look at the next line. You can see this one coming about tears, right? When thou weepest, unkindly kind, my life's blood doth decay. In other words, if I really am a part of you, am I a part of you? You can imagine him saying this to her. Am I a part of you? And she goes, well, yeah. Well, then every time you cry, part of you, physically, your tears, leaving your body. That's like killing me. Because I'm a part of you. I am a part of you, right? You can kind of imagine that she's kind of going, well, yeah. And when you cry, then a part of me, that's you, is actually leaving. Stop killing me. It's a fascinating argument. Stop crying, in other words, because when you cry, you're killing me. Of course, there's another way to understand this, and this is a genius of a metaphysical poet. What's he really saying? When you cry and when you sigh like this, you are killing me because you're making me sad to have to go. I don't have a choice. I got to go. Right, I have to leave. But you're making me sad to leave, even worse. And that's not good for me. It's killing me. Please stop. Look at the next one.